But apparently there's 5 justices who are pro-government, and they've decided that they're just going to make decisions.
Right. So you can see how creative that they are, right?
well, is that even consistent with the Constitution?
No.
That President Lai is people outside Taiwan are very surprised when you make that accusation. Could you explain why the TPP takes that view?
A lot of people say that we can still protest. People say we can still talk, but that's absurdly low standard for democracy. The modern democratic backslidings always happen in an invisible and a gradual way, with the breaking the checks and balances and abusing the procedures. So instead of like silencing everyone overnight.
Hi, I'm Ross Feingold, an American lawyer working in Taiwan, and I'm here with Ann Lai, who is a Taiwan lawyer. And today we're going to be discussing why Taiwan has a number of constitutional crises, which in my opinion is an accurate word to describe it, because there are a number of disputes between the legislative branch, the executive branch, and even the judicial branch or the constitutional court that's led to the situation we're in. And let's first try and understand, how did we get here and into what's now an impeachment process against President Lai? We'll talk about the impeachment process shortly, but give us a little bit of the background. Why do we have a constitutional crisis between the legislative branch and the executive branch?
Right now, there are 5 laws that they don't want to enforce. So President Lai and Premier Zhuo, they basically argue it infringes upon the executive power, and implementing those laws causes irreversible damage.
So they say we don't like the law, so we don't want to implement it.
Right.
Is there latitude to do that under Taiwan's constitutional framework? Because in the United States, of course, the president could simply veto a law. Congress has the ability to override the law. But that's not what they're doing here. How have they taken this? When I say they, I'm referring to the executive branch. What have they done to actually stop the implementation?
If they do believe that there's something unconstitutional or invalid, they can basically file the reconsideration, ask the legislative yuan to reconsider the bill. And in some cases, Premier Zhuo already did it, and then he already exercised his veto power. And then we call it the reconsideration of the bill.
So it goes back to the legislative yuan for a vote again.
Yes, and the legislative yuan already, subsequently rejected it, but so he has to accept it immediately right after the legislative yuan reaffirms the bill.
So they have a revote and they say, we still like the bill, we're going to vote yes again.
Mm-hmm.
And then what did the premier do?
The premier now said, I don't want to enforce this, because he argues this is something will cause the damage on national security or national development. The argument is always pretty similar. But the things that you have to respect the rule of the law. That is the foundation of the democracy. You cannot simply just boycott it, right? The determination should not be made or solely at the discretion of the president or the premier. It is not their prerogative to unilaterally decide which law should force or should not be enforced.
So what's this thing about the counter-signature, though? Could you explain that?
Also, whatever the term you want to use, the counter-signature, counter-signing, the signing the law, it doesn't matter. It was never intended to be the weapon against the legislative oversight or a legislative yuan. So again, this is just not their constitutional authority to simply boycott it. If they want to do the veto, they can do the reconsideration. The president must promulgated it, and then the Premier Zhuo has to sign it into the law as well.
So it requires both the president and the premier to basically put a stamp on a bill after it's passed the legislature.
That means I already rated the bill. That they basically share the joint responsibility with the President Lai.
And then it could be implemented after that. Right. But the premier is saying, in some cases, I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to sign it.
Right. So he basically destroyed the the constitutional law and claim that he has the right to do so.
But why would the president sign it only for the premier not to sign it? Why doesn't the president just say, our government, and the premier works for the president, so, well, why doesn't the president in the first stage just say, I don't like this law, I disagree, it's bad for the country, I'm not going to sign it? Why would the president sign it only for the premier then to say, I'm not going to sign it?
I think the word promulgated doesn't really have the room for them to interpret the other way around. But the countersigning is something that they believe they have the room, but actually there's no any room for interpretation.
Is there any precedent for this? Has, going back years in the past, did a premier ever take this position that Premier Joe was now saying? Did a premier ever say, well, it's passed the legislative yuan, the bill's passed the legislative yuan, the president has promulgated, but I'm going to unilaterally decide not to countersign it. Has this happened before?
Yes, once before, but that was used as the weapon against a president instead of a legislative yuan.
Is he a lawyer, by the way?
No.
So where did he come up with the basis for this then?
Maybe someone, their think tank, offered this kind of idea for them. Anyway, they have so many ways, have so many reasons to bypass, to get the thing around, to work around, to solve the problem that they have. So it's all about the mindset. It's not about what's the fact. It's about how authoritarian they are. They will also find millions of reasons to get around this.
Good answer. So you've made a lot of points about the premier not following the constitutional process. The president has promulgated a bill that was passed by the legislative yuan. The premier is saying, I don't have to sign it. I don't have to implement it. If that's the case, why don't you just use the mechanism that's in the Constitution to have a no confidence vote in the premier?
It's meaningless, and then this has no impact, the real impact on precedence of power in reality.
Why is that?
The premier is not approved by the legislative yuan.
So even if you have a new election for the legislative yuan, the president could still just pick whoever he wants to be the premier?
Yes.
So we have the president promulgate the law that was passed by the legislative yuan. The premier is taking this unique position that I'm not going to countersign it or implement it. So what happens next?
So that's why the opposition party filed an impeachment proceeding against him now.
How does that work, though? What's the steps, briefly, in the impeachment? I mean, does the legislative yuan just have a vote and majority could just remove the president?
Unfortunately, no. The opposition party doesn't have enough vote to get him impeached, but we just want to put this into the historical records to, like, the history to show what's happened if the president's being or has such anti-democratic ambitions and behavior.
And so there'll be a lot of discussion. You'll state your position that the premier shouldn't block the implementation of the law. You'll criticize President Lai for his government doing this. And then eventually there'll be a vote in the legislative yuan. But at the end of that process, President Lai will still be the president and Premier Cho will still be the premier.
Right. It's a deadlock now. Right. So our constitution's system so far failed to correct him. That we all know that. So it's very hard to rely on checks and balances to constrain the President Lai, because our politics are highly polarized. We don't have enough votes, as I mentioned, to get him impeached, and his member from his party will just, stick with him until the end.
If the premier thinks or the government thinks that a law is unconstitutional, I mean, normally my understanding is they would go to the constitutional court. Taiwan has a constitutional court, but the constitutional court is also not operating properly. Can you explain that?
Right. A lot of frustration comes from cronyism. You can see the nomination list of the Grand Justice. It was just highly political. Some people describe this as a green patronage. So, in the past, former President Chen Shui-bian, he also faces very similar political deadlock, but he knows how to resolve the problem by proposing the balanced list and then negotiate with the opposition party. So we all know, a compromises and the negotiation is something pretty essential. But President Lai, he hasn't done that. He always did something, act unilaterally without prior consultation.
My understanding is that there's currently 8 justices on the Constitutional Court, but the quorum requirement is 10, and the legislature and the president can't agree on the new nominees, as you discussed. But apparently there's 5 justices who are pro-government, and they've decided that they're just going to make decisions.
Right. So you can see how creative that they are, right?
Well, is that even consistent with the Constitution?
No.
That 5 justices could say we're going to ignore the quorum requirement?
Our constitutional court requires a minimum of the grand justices to operate, to hold a meeting illegally. So the purpose is pretty obvious, to prevent small minority making decision for the entire, on behalf of the entire populations. So it's like a quorum. And then right now we have the 8 justices, 5 of them agree to participate, and another 3 reject to participate. So they just stop counting another 3 seats altogether and then redefine the new number, the total number, as 5 instead of 8. They say that 3 seats are vacancing or
how could they be vacant if they're actually, those justices are still justices of the Constitutional Court?
Right. So and then where does it even stop, right? How about 4 justices? How about 3? Because they can redefine the total number as 5, then where does it stop? Even 1 justice is enough to hold a meeting.
So how is that going to get resolved?
So that's why it's a deadlock again. So they still operate the meeting and then claim whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional.
Your party seems to be taking the view that President Lai is a dictator or totalitarian. I mean, people outside Taiwan are very surprised when you make that accusation. Could you explain why the TPP takes that view?
A lot of people say that we can still protest. People say we can still talk, but that's absurdly low standard for democracy. The modern democratic backslidings always happen in the invisible and the gradual way, with the breaking the checks and balances and abusing the procedures. So instead of silencing everyone overnight, so I would say, yes, we can talk. Of course, we can talk, but there's a growing cost. And people have been detained. People have been public shamed and trolled just for opposing the government. So, it's pretty similar to what's happened to America went through the McCarthyism in 1950s with the anti-communist witch hunt hysteria. So we have the veneer of the civilization, but the democracy is pretty fragile now.
Another big issue that was in the news recently was this prosecutor general appointment. What happened there?
Yeah, it just happened recently, and then we can't believe how authoritarian he is. He bypassed the legislature by appointing Xu Xixiang as prosecutor general.
What do you mean by he bypassed the legislature?
Because the parliaments already say no to this nomination.
So he was nominated and rejected.
Right, it's rejected, but he still instilled him through this appointment, this acting appointment.
How long can he remain as the acting?
I think it can be just
open-ended?
Yes.
So it's just completely go around the legislature.
That's why it also set very pernicious precedents to the executive overreach.
The other issue that's been getting a lot of international media attention and, of course, attention in the United States is this special defense budget that the Legislative Yuan passed last week. The amount that was in the budget was about $25 billion US. That's less than the $40 billion that President Lai had requested. Why is there a gap between what the 2 opposition parties agreed to and what President Lai requested?
Yeah, that is another example to show how authoritarian he is. Last November, he just suddenly announced this major national security policy via Washington Post commentary that he proposed for $40 billion USD defense budget. And he did this without any courtesy to first alert to main opposition parties representing legislative yuan that he was about to go public with something as significant to our Taiwan national security and something as costly as this. So he always does that. And honestly, we shouldn't be surprised about this because it didn't start during this presidency. Based on his behavioral patterns, it also happened to when he was the Tainan mayor. He rejected to participate the city council, to be questioned, to be scrutinized, to be he rejected to face any oversight. So this anti-democratic mindset is ingrained in him.
You've made a lot of accusations today about President Lai and Democratic backsliding. People outside Taiwan don't really believe this. Why don't they believe it?
I think the foreign press, they mostly get the information from DPP, which is pretty one-sided and partial. And then regarding domestic information right now in Taiwan, it's, some people call it as an unholy trinity involving DPP, prosecutors, and also some parts of the media. So it's an ecosystem that they are highly independent and reinforce one another, making it pretty difficult for the opposition's perspective reach the international community.
People outside Taiwan think that the media in Taiwan is controlled by people who don't like President Lai. Is that inaccurate?
Of course, inaccurate. I think all the viewer, listener, citizen just have to do the work necessary to listen to the other side. The premise of a democracy is that we all benefit from people who disagree. But right now, the environment here is pretty unhealthy, that people just, a lot of discourse about the discourse, if that makes sense. So, and then it's all about the rhetoric is all about how terrible the other side is, and then we shouldn't listen to them. So to me, that's really worries me. Something really worries me.
And who's responsible for that? The government would say you're responsible for that. They would say you're not a loyal opposition.
We just have to do more effort to listen to the other side, and then we won't get sick from above.
Well, based on what you just said, it sounds like everyone in Taiwan society, or at least in the political world, they're all arguing with each other and everybody hates each other. Is that an accurate description of the situation?
Yes, it is. So it's pretty sad, and I feel sorry for DPP. They always claim that the opposition party is their enemy, but they are their real enemy.
How so?
The current leadership and the mainstream factions, they are betraying their own founding spirit and the legacy. They was a symbol of the resistance against authoritarianism. But right now, they just use a lot of hateful rhetoric, and then you can see a lot of people has been detained, as I mentioned earlier. So they are the one who jeopardize all of this. How about U.S. presidential impeachments, especially regarding President Trump? How does that work in the States, and what does the U.S. Constitution say about it?
The challenge the Democrats had in the U.S. is in the House of Representatives, you just need a majority to impeach the president. So they had the votes. They had a majority at the time. So they were able to pass the impeachment. But then when it gets to the Senate, the Constitution requires a 2/3 vote to remove the president from office. And the Democrats were not even close to having 2/3 vote in the Senate. So that's why both times that President Trump was impeached during 2019, 2020, and then in 2021, towards the end of his presidency, the Democrats just didn't have enough votes to remove him, so the impeachment failed.
Okay, so has any president been successfully impeached?
Well, they've had impeachments, but Bill Clinton was also impeached. But there's never been a president who's been removed from office by a vote of the Senate because, usually there's not 2/3 vote to remove the president. And then Nixon resigned because there was the possibility that there'd be 2/3 vote in the Senate, but he resigned before that vote was actually held. So the answer is no, there's never been a president removed from office by a 2/3 vote of the Senate.
So it seems like there's no any democratic country can really resort the constitutional mechanism to get the president down.
Well, I like to say the best way to handle these things is at the ballot box and let the voters decide at the next election. That's one of the reasons why I thought the mass recall here in Taiwan in 2025 was not healthy for democracy, because those legislators had been voted into office not long before, about a year and a half before. I thought if some of the public wants to throw them out of office, then the best way to do it is at the next election. I mean, that's why I think having well-educated voters and robust election processes are actually important, and not trying to use these other mechanisms to remove people from office. President Lai is going to be in office for at least 2 more years because his term ends May 20th, 2028. So what would you like him to do differently in the next 2 years?
I think we really want a leader who is both genuinely combative and conciliatory. You really need to know how to negotiate and compromise, and how to deal with the dynamic in the legislative branch. As I mentioned, in the minority governments, negotiation and compromise is something very essential.
So diplomatic. I thought you would be more.
More what?
You should say he needs to stop being so damn arrogant. Say something with.
I don't want to use any hateful rhetoric.
马子斌很适合来做台湾节，你越来越嗜血。
对，他已经被影响，在这边太久了。
我刚认识你的时候，你不是这样子。
真的吗？最近被攻击，我就越来越生气了。I'm Ross Feingold, an American lawyer in Taiwan, and I've been discussing the upcoming impeachment vote against President Lai in Taiwan's legislative yuan with Taiwan People's Party external counsel Ann Lai. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hey, 你现在像不像木村拓哉还是张小泉？
我觉得如果他像木村拓哉，你就像 Tom Cruise。
所以你意思是他不是你的菜吗？
不是，我觉得你长得更像 Tom Cruise。Do you eat sprouted potatoes?
I love made in America fruit and vegetables, even with sprouted. 都是吃美国农产品哦。